What is the evidence for Jesus outside of the New Testament? How reliable are accounts of Jesus in Josephus and Tacitus? And what do they contribute to our understanding of the historical Jesus? Our guest today, Dr. Gary Habermas, is arguably the foremost authority on the resurrection of Jesus and has written extensively on this topic. Gary, I'm looking forward to having you out to Biola to speak to our master students this summer. And I noticed you wore red because you're coming out to Biola soon.
Yeah, that's the reason. Do you have a little bit of black in it or not?
I'm just messing with you. No worries at all. Well, we're gonna jump into your thoughts on the evidence for Jesus outside of the Bible. And I'm really curious.
Okay.
You've been studying this since the 70s. How would you say scholarly discussion about Jesus outside the Bible has shifted in that 4 decades plus?
Well, that's a loaded question, and for a number of reasons. Back in the 70s, F.F. Bruce had written a book on Jesus outside the New Testament, and he was one of the only ones who had commented on this. And then a few years later, R.T. France, Dick France, who was a professor of New Testament, British professor at what is now London School of Theology, wrote a book on the evidence for Jesus. And I came along. A few others wrote. A few Catholic scholars did books, but there weren't a lot. And I came along and I wrote a manuscript. It's kind of a cute story. The publisher sent it to F.F. Bruce, and he was one of the outside reviewers. And they said, "What do you think about this?" And he wrote comments that were beautiful. And they sent me a copy of what he said.
Wow.
And Bruce said, and he's got a book on it already. And he said, "This is great stuff." He literally said, I've got it in my file. He literally said, "This is the best I've ever seen. I'd recommend you publish it." All right. So the company said, the cute thing is, not giving myself a compliment, the cuter story is how we are as humans. The publisher, Thomas Nelson, said, "Would you do the foreword for the book?" And he said, "I'd be glad to." And when he wrote it, it was not that rosy.
Oh.
It was not everything wonderful. I mean, it was good. It was a good review.
Sure.
But it wasn't just, "Oh, wow, this is really good." A capable job, like that. And,
Gotcha.
And then he made a comment at the end. I wouldn't have discussed the Shroud of Turin. So,
well, we're gonna get to the Shroud of Turin.
It's changed a little. A couple of things.
Go ahead.
Van Voorst wrote a book, and with Erdmans. It's probably the best one out right now. Jesus outside the New Testament.
Okay. So would you say, is there more confidence in the historical Jesus sources outside of the Bible than there was in the 70s? Or has scholarship moved towards more skepticism on those?
What if I said there's more agreement and a lot of attestation from these sources, but many scholars, if not most, don't give a rip? And they don't because they think, yeah, these are good, but the best sources, you got to kind of hang on to your chair here. The best sources are in the New Testament, and Paul in particular. So you have the Jesus mythers saying, "Nah, you can't use the New Testament. That's prejudice. Christians talking about Christians." And here's the atheist and agnostic and skeptical New Testament scholars like Bart Ehrman saying, "I'm sorry, but the New Testament is a very good book. Depending on who you're using, Paul is the best." And that's where it is now. So the secular sources are secondary, but the best ones are not disputed.
Okay. Why do you think there's not more evidence for Jesus outside the Bible? I often hear from skeptics or critics that if this really happened, we should have way more sources. So what would you say to that claim?
Yeah, they're really overestimating how many scholars were writing in those days and how many would say more than a paragraph. Most of the extra biblical sources on Jesus, it would surprise people. We have more than a dozen. and they're usually a half a sentence, a sentence. If you've got a paragraph, you're tearing it up. That's a great source. But they'll let the half a sentence, and that goes. Those are good texts. But you're not going to get more for a bunch of reasons. One is there aren't that many scholars. Secondly, Israel was a very obscure place. Thirdly, many people didn't like the Jews and didn't care anything they were doing and didn't pay attention to them. And I would think some people in the Roman Empire, take Suetonius, his 12 Caesars, some of these guys, they're emperor worshipers. And they most likely didn't want to talk about somebody that went across against their own religion. But I think for most people, I would say, hey, don't ignore the 15, even though they're briefer than we might like.
So a minute ago you said 12 and then you said 15. Are you referring to non-Christian sources within like the first 2 or 3 centuries? Give us the scope.
Look, if you're going to let me go 2 or 3 centuries, I'll have far more than that.
Okay.
But here's why I change. Bart Ehrman counts sources for Jesus 100 years after the crucifixion. Now, he dates the crucifixion to 30 AD, so he's going to go sources up to 130 AD.
Okay.
When I did my book, The Historical Jesus, the one that F.F. Bruce was talking about, I do 150 years after Jesus. There's no rule how much you could use or not use, but I used 150 years later, and if you say 2 or 3 centuries, I'm going to pick up a lot. But when I did 150 years later, I believe I had 17 sources or potential sources for Jesus. So 17, almost a dozen and a half.
And these are all non-Christian sources. Is that what you refer to?
Absolutely. Non-Christian sources are in a few cases archaeology, which doesn't come with belief or unbelief, etc.
Okay. Could you give us a broad sense of the different kind of sources, maybe within that window that you're talking about? So these could be Gnostic sources. These could be church fathers. These could be Jewish sources. Like if you're going to lay out for somebody what evidence we have outside of Jesus, what are some of these big sources within that 150 years?
All right, let me start with the secular ones. There is a dialogue that's been published by InterVarsity, and they talk, I believe, to 5 scholars on what we can know about the historical Jesus. One is an evangelical, and that's Darrell Bach, and the others are all critical scholars. You're talking everyone from Bob Price, who leans toward Jesus never lived. He's one of only 2, as Bart Ehrman counts them, 2 well-accredited scholars who take that view. You've got John Dominic Crossan, sadly the late, we need a scholarship, James D.G. Dunn, and Luke Timothy Johnson, and then, of course, one evangelical out of 5. And here's where they all agreed. They all agreed, maybe even Bob Price, the mythicist, would agree that the best sources are Tacitus and Josephus, the 2 you already mentioned.
Okay.
They're the best. But here's just one example. Bart Ehrman gives about 15 sources for the crucifixion in the first 100 years. 15 different sources. Most of them are in the New Testament. But he also counts the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, Josephus, Tacitus. That gives you 4. Plus, he thinks the second 6 Pauline epistles are Deutero-Pauline. So those would actually be they would essentially be non-canonical voices. They're in the canon, but they're essentially don't count. So that would mean half of his sources are not cited the same way conservatives do. Oh, by the way, if you want some Gnostic sources besides Peter doesn't appear to be Gospel of Peter doesn't appear to be Gnostic. Thomas, there's 3 kinds of saints in Thomas. Some Gnostic ones, some Orthodox ones, and some odd ones. I mean, really odd ones. Like scratch a tree, scratch the bark, and you will find me there. So, that's kind of crazy. But there are other ones. The Gospel of Truth, if you go a little bit further than 100 years, the Gospel of Truth, Treatise on Resurrection, you'd have to put those in there. So there's a few Gnostic sources as you get out toward 150. And if you go all the way to 150, which is only 120 years, now you've got Just a Martyr, and he's huge. He is. And you've got a couple others with fragments or just small amounts. So we've got a good group.
So if we're talking about what we can know about Jesus historically speaking, what value would you put in those Gnostic Gospels or Gnostic sources within that window?
I assume you mean historical value.
Historical value.
And, excuse me. Virtually nobody counts them for anything.
Okay.
What they're going to say is these are theological books grinding the Gnostic axe, and they're not even talking about history as a general rule. They're talking about truth and what we can know in what we now call a Gnostic sense. Now, somebody could say, well, that's a New Testament sources too. They're grinding an axe. Right. First of all, it's the mythers who usually say that. They're generally not accredited New Testament scholars. They're not trained that way. Carrier and Price are examples. Are exceptions. But you've got very few who are going to count anything from the Gnostic books. Now, you get to Paul, though, in the New Testament. Critics will let the 7 books of Paul go. You are free to quote the 7 books of Paul. And now those are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians. Then you've got Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Those 7, you can cite them. And I would say if you're a pastor giving a series on the best Pauline sources, they're going to be the books you're going to use. They're really good ones. 1 Thessalonians is probably the earliest, about 50 AD. So they're great sources. And let me make this last point. You can use Paul. They don't think Paul is inspired.
Sure.
But they do think he's a good scholar. Paul basically had a PhD in Old Testament.
Okay.
And he's a good scholar. He's an eyewitness. And as Ehrman says, he knew the guys who were the eyewitnesses and he interviewed them.
Okay.
So you can cite Paul all you want. They don't have to agree with you, but they'll largely agree with you.
So we've got the Gospels, we got the source of Paul, we have these Gnostic Gospels and texts that actually offer minimal historical value. What historical value for those who are trying to get behind the Jesus of faith to the Jesus of history, so to speak, would other Christian sources outside of the Bible play? So, right, Ignatius or Clement of Rome within the window that you're talking about. Maybe we're brushing up towards like Polycarp. How helpful are these sources for the historical Jesus?
Those are very helpful, and I'll tell you why. Bart Ehrman's going to count them because they're going to go up to because they go up to 130 AD. So they're within his 100 years. He's up to 130 AD. Let me give some dates. If John is the oldest gospel at about 95, you've got Clement perhaps written the same year. He may be the same Clement mentioned by Paul, and he is written about 95 AD. Okay, you've got Ignatius about 107, and Polycarp about 110. That means that Clement and Polycarp maximum are about 10 years after the Gospel of John. Papias is often dated about 125. Those dates are starting to switch around a little bit now on Papias, but he's often dated as at 125. And I know a New Testament scholar, one of the best in the country, who, if I remember correctly, did his master's thesis on the date for Papias and argued that it should be 110 AD, the same as Polycarp. Unfortunately, his major work that everybody would give an arm and a leg to get it, the exposition of the oracles of the Lord, it's wonderful, only exists in fragments.
Okay, so you already mentioned the crucifixion, but if we were going to talk about what historical kind of facts we can ascertain without the Gospels or the New Testament, just from the church fathers, what are some of the key historical truths that we could kind of garner related to the historical Jesus? Obviously, the crucifixion, you've got Tacitus and Josephus mentioned that. What are some other details we could know from these sources that you trust that are non-Christian in that window?
Yeah, if you want to go from about John 95 to Papias about 125, uh, you can get a couple other things, a couple other ones also in fragments. One of them reports Jesus' miracles and says that Jesus was that the followers who saw the miracles were still alive, and that might make you want to put that one back a bit in time. But they record, for example, Clement, 95 A.D. He talks about a very important passage. He talks about the Jesus appearing to the disciples, and he showed himself to them, and because of the resurrection, they were able to take that information and what I call set out on the yellow brick road that leads you to the Emerald City. So Christians would take the resurrection of Jesus all the way to heaven, and the resurrection was the reason. And Clement's comment is like Paul's, where Paul says, we take this and we give it to other men, and they can give it to others and make them faithful people. Hebrews says we learn first from the prophets, then from the apostles, and lastly it's come down to us and we give it to you. That chain of command, Clement says that. And he says we learned it from Jesus. Jesus told the apostle told us, and here's the truth. So there are about a half dozen to 8 passages in Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp by 110 AD. You can throw a couple fragments of
Papias in there.
Papias in there, and what he says about Mark, for example, very valuable. You can throw those in there, and we have about getting close to 10 what we could call historical passages that tell us things about Jesus, and almost always they zero in on the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus, what we call the gospel.
Are you aware of any historical facts that contradict the Gospels and the New Testament in Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, and the Papias fragments, just on the historical details, not theology? Can you think of any that seem to contradict, or they just support it?
No, critics could come in there and say, and they could pick a passage that you've read 100 times, but you never thought of it from this other angle, and they could say, that could be a disagreement, but there's no major passage in there that everybody's going to sit on and say this is a loser.